Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome to the fastest show in politics. This is kind of like the old days. Remember the fastest hour in politics? That's what we have today as we hand things off to our colleagues a little early today at Bloomberg Business Week. It is the 10th of October, and we're tracking Milton along with the candidates here, as always. The president getting his daily brief today and being briefed throughout the day on Hurricane Milton, with the storyline here. Could have been a lot worse, certainly according to people on the ground. There are still a lot of issues to deal with, though. More than 3 million people without power, a storm surge that has left floodwaters in many places contaminated, a real issue today as rescue crews start their work here. The storm is blasting out into the Atlantic, and we have Lauren Rosenthal back with us, who's been an indispensable voice since we first heard the word Helene. Now we've added the name Milton. She is Bloomberg's weather reporter, and Lauren joins us from World Headquarters in New York. So it's made its way across the state here, Lauren. How would you describe the impact of this storm?
We knew that there would be a lot of water and a lot of flooding from Hurricane Milton, and that has definitely turned out to be the case. While storm surge estimates are still rolling in, and it's going to take some time because, readings are difficult to confirm. They'll have to get crews out to look at high water marks on some buildings. It looks like surge was about 5 to 8 feet in the Tampa Bay area. That is a lot of water, has caused a lot of localized flooding, and we also saw record-breaking one-day rainfall from Hurricane Milton. Yesterday, more than 18 inches of rain fell at an airport in St. Petersburg that beats the existing record by more than half a foot. So there is a lot of water. It's complicating efforts to get to people, to see how communities are doing, to try to start assessing the damage and then figuring out where to go next.
To see the roof torn off Tropicana Field was pretty remarkable, some of the optics here. But the narrative, and you can tell me if this is even fair, Lauren, is that the state managed to avoid a worst-case scenario. Is that true?
That's definitely what we're hearing from, I think it was Governor Ron DeSantis said that at a briefing this morning. There was the potential for significantly higher surge. There was a real concern that Tampa Bay would see its first direct hit from a landfalling hurricane in more than a century, which would have caused catastrophic damage, in a region that's home to more than 3 million people. The storm hit slightly further south. Obviously, some emergency managers told me even before landfall, if Tampa is spared a direct hit, it is still really bad for someone else. And I think that's still what we'll be seeing over the coming days. This is going to be a complicated recovery, especially on the heels of Hurricane Helene just 2 weeks ago.
Understood. And it's a really important point that you make. The National Hurricane Center says, as of at least the update 1 hour ago, that Milton could still cause, quote, considerable urban flooding, unquote, in some areas as additional rain falls on a swath of the state between Orlando and Jacksonville. Lauren, how worried should we be about what's left here?
I definitely think, the risk is not over. Milton is a very large storm now. Its tropical storm force winds extend for more than 300 miles. So even though Milton's eye is close to pushing back out over the open ocean, its winds and rain are still going to leave lingering effects for the eastern coast of Florida. They're definitely not out of the woods yet. The Hurricane Center is advising people to please pay attention to local flood warnings, to be careful with those winds. 80 miles an hour right now, top sustained winds and higher gusts possible. That's definitely not something you want to take lightly.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Lauren Rosenthal, Bloomberg weather reporter, doing great work for us here to keep tabs on this storm. It's not over yet. A boil water notice issued, I see clearly here in St. Petersburg, due to water main breaks from Hurricane Milton. A citywide boil water notice is now in effect for St. Petersburg, Gulfport, South Pasadena, Leelman. This is the case around a large swath of the Gulf Coast of Florida where clean water is going to be an issue. A lot of the floodwaters have been contaminated by sewage. So we've got a power situation, a water situation for at least those who have been left behind. And they include Kathy Castor, the Democrat from Florida's 14th district. The Congresswoman was with us ahead of the storm and is back with us now on the line, having lost power with more than 3 million people out. Congresswoman, I thank you for making the time to talk to us today in the throes of the recovery of this storm. Can you just give us the lay of the land where you are now?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. This is a harsh double whammy. Hurricane Helene, then Hurricane Milton within 2 weeks. So we're grappling with the short-term challenges that you've mentioned: power outages, fuel shortages, critical infrastructure, water and wastewater that need to be repaired. But I'll tell you, the long-term economic harm to our way of life in Florida also is going to be critical. We're already suffering a property insurance crisis. We pay the highest rates by far than any place across the country. Electric bills have been out of sight, and this is the new abnormal, I'm afraid, because of extreme hot temperatures, an overheating Gulf of Mexico. It's my fear that this will become routine. So what I'll be looking for in a disaster supplemental in Congress is safeguarding taxpayer dollars. Build it when we build back, do it in a more resilient way, do it in a smarter way. For example, MacDill Air Force Base is a critical economic engine here. They've had some flooding. How do we safeguard the missions at the base? Same thing for our Coast Guard Air Station in Clearwater. And then the city of Tampa, Pinellas County, all of our water and wastewater rebuilding. We're going to have to be smarter about how we do it.
Well, that's you just said a lot, Congresswoman. I want to unpack some of the things that you just said, if you can bear with me through a couple of questions here. We understand that swift water teams were active overnight and have continued with water rescues this morning. Do those continue now, or are we getting beyond the rescue phase of this operation? I think we may have lost the Congresswoman. Can you hear me? Congresswoman Castor?
I can hear you now.
Got you. Are there still water rescues underway now? We know that swift boat teams were out overnight.
Yes, there are. There's one assisted living facility in North Tampa near the University of South Florida where they are sending school buses over to get folks out. Because this was much more of a rain event, there are places that maybe they didn't flood during Helene. That was a coastal flood surge event. So this is a real double whammy. And the first course of business is making sure everyone is safe. That's a saving grace. They went to shelters. They left the evacuation zones, and I think that's why the loss of life is going to be minimal here in the Tampa Bay area. But I really feel for the folks who had to deal with these outrageous tornadoes on the eastern side of the state.
Yeah. It's very scary stuff, Congresswoman. We're showing our viewers images of Tropicana Field, which is now convertible after last night. We saw actual rainwater on the grass in the park here. You mentioned people in shelters. There are more than 70,000 in government shelters now. That stadium was supposed to be one of them. Does Florida have room for everyone?
We do. A lot of our public schools are converted over to shelters, but I think a serious long-term issue will be the tens of thousands of my neighbors who were flooded out by Hurricane Helene, and where are they going to go? They have all of their lives out in their front yards. They try to collect as much debris, but where are we going to house them? And thank goodness FEMA is here delivering the disaster aid into people's bank accounts that they need. I've heard of thousands of dollars going into people's bank accounts to make sure that they can relocate, pay rent, and get the assistance they need.
Well, that's awfully important based on some of the misinformation that surrounded the response to Hurricane Helene. You can tell us then that FEMA is on the ground and is active now on this day after the storm. Yes,
they were active in the days after Helene. FEMA Administrator Dan Criswell was here last week talking with Mayor Castor of Tampa, Mayor Welch of St. Petersburg. She's going to be back. President Biden is checking in with all of us, Vice President Harris. This is an unprecedented response I've seen by FEMA, the largest mobilization in recent history, and we're going to need it. We're going to need everyone's help to rebuild and do it in a smarter way and take care of our neighbors.
Mm-hmm. We're spending time talking with Congresswoman Castor, who represents Florida's 14th district. That includes the Tampa Bay area. And she's on the phone right now because she has no power, like 3 million other people in that part of Florida. Congresswoman, you mentioned funding for FEMA. We understand the agency does have enough money for the individual assistance program, but there are some worries about the SBA not being able to help businesses turn the lights back on. You mentioned the possibility of a supplemental or an emergency request, and I saw a posting on Twitter from your Republican colleague in the House, Anna Paulina Luna. Of all people, Congresswoman, it looks like she is working with President Biden here. She says he is personally overseeing that FEMA does not create problems with debris removal and is supportive of $15 billion in FEMA funds only for hurricane victims. It sounds like the Florida delegation is working with the administration on this. What can you tell us?
It is going to take a bipartisan, cooperative response to get the disaster supplemental that we need. I don't think $15 billion is going to cover everything that we're going to need for Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina especially. But yes, we're going to need those SBA funds. They're very important for businesses and individuals to rebuild over the long term. And then all of the critical water, wastewater infrastructure is going to have a price tag to it.
Anna Paulina Luna writing on X, Congresswoman, this needs to happen. Speaker Johnson, call us back. Is that the case? And have you heard from leadership about this yet?
I haven't heard from Republican leadership, but I just got off the phone with the lead Democrat from Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut, who is asking for us to be working with our local and federal partners to track of the harm and the damages here so that we can get things rebuilt as quickly as possible. But this is going to be job one for the Congress when we come back. And it's and as I said, if we're going to safeguard the taxpayer dollars, we have to rebuild in a more resilient way in our energy systems, our water systems, and where we allow development to.
Hopefully you're still with us, Congresswoman. I know that there's a lot of demand on the cell phone infrastructure in Florida right now without power especially. Can you still hear us, Congresswoman?
I can.
Okay, great. I'll ask you lastly, and you've been very generous with your time, that there was an executive order issued by Governor Ron DeSantis allowing election supervisors to consolidate voting centers or relocate them if they're flooded or destroyed, easing some rules as well for mail-in ballots. Is enough being done to help people access ballots as early voting continues ahead of November?
This is going to be a primary focus, Joe, because in Hillsborough County, vote-by-mail ballots arrived in mailboxes last Saturday. So if you had been flooded out of your home, like tens of thousands were during Helene, I'm not sure you received that ballot. So we're going to need a lot of flexibility. But right now, I think it's making sure everyone is safe, and then there'll be plenty of time for elections. But we'll need that extra time and extra flexibility for sure.
I can't thank you enough for giving us your time, Congresswoman. I'm sure you're hearing not only from constituents but family and friends, and I appreciate your time today. Castor, Florida's 14th district, of course, right where the hurricane went through in the wee hours of this morning, late last night, in fact. Congresswoman Castor has no power, which is why she was on the line with us, and we appreciate the insights here. I'm Mathieu in Washington. Glad you're with us today on Balance of Power as we gauge the aftermath of this storm, the political impacts, of course, the economic impacts as well on this CPI day. There are some concerns about the potential for inflation in things like fertilizer and other items that are made in the storm path. I will mention as well, the White House has just added some remarks from the president, who's being briefed, we're told, throughout the day today from FEMA officials. 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Joe Biden will deliver remarks on the initial impacts of Milton. I'm just reading directly from the White House schedule here that was just released. He will talk as well about the ongoing support to state and local officials. We'll do that from the old executive office building next door, across the driveway from the West Wing. We'll have ears on that for you. Our panel is on the way in next. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, this day after the storm, on the fastest hour in politics. Glad you're with us. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
CPI Day. Charlie Pellet with the deep tease. Yeah, Molly Smith is coming in. You heard the words he said. Higher than expected. And that's kind of all you need to know today. If you were paying attention to that jobs report last week, now everybody, all the naysayers have a little more grist for the mill. And yes, Molly Smith with us after an early morning editing the copy here on the terminal and online. She's Bloomberg's economics editor. Molly, it's great to see you. You connect the dots, and as journalists, we like to try to reach for a trend. And this is pouring a little bit of cold water on the idea of winning the war on inflation. But is that the case, or does it simply remind us that this doesn't move in a straight line?
Exactly. That's more the takeaway, that this is going to be a bumpy path. We actually just heard New York Fed President John Williams describe that there are going to be, quote, wiggles along the way. I thought that was a fun way of describing it. So it's not a straight line down. But that said, it does seem to be that the fundamental drivers of disinflation are still intact. And we got good news on that front, at least in today's report, showing that shelter costs, that's really been the big one holding back the bigger progress, that housing costs did moderate in September. So that was very welcome to see. But of course, you don't like to see the things that flared up. Car prices were a big one. Also saw apparel, car insurance, stadium admissions for sporting events that tied in with the start of the NFL season. So definitely a lot of things there that I think economists seem to be painting more as one-offs and not so much the big drivers of what's going to bring inflation down.
Okay, so that's good. We're not going to freak out today. What did we learn about shelter prices this time? I know that's something you've been watching closely.
Definitely, yeah. This was really welcome to see that shelter was up 0.2% on the month, and that's compared to 0.5% in August, so a really big step down there. The thing is, though, a lot of it was by hotel prices, which can be really volatile from month to month, and people had actually been expecting hotel prices to go up in September, and to see them fall was quite a big surprise, so that dragged down the overall shelter measure. But the thing that you really want to look at within shelter is how people are, their actual housing costs, not just the hotel stays. So those ones were definitely more tame, those rental measures. So that was definitely good to see today.
So the next question, of course, needs to be about the Fed, right? I was looking at writing from our colleagues at Bloomberg Economics, Anna Wong and Stuart Paul. Despite the upside surprise, they say, and this kind of echoes your point, we do not think the report will alter the FOMC's view that inflation is on a downtrend trajectory. So what does that mean for rates going forward?
So it looks like, based on the trading in the market today, that there's just more conviction for the November meeting to be a 25 basis point cut, which was already moving in that direction after the strong jobs report last week that you mentioned. Honestly, I was thinking there might be a bit more argument that there could be some debate as to whether there's a pause after these latest two data points that came in pretty strong. But you also had jobless claims today rise to the highest level in over a year. Definitely reflected some weakness from Hurricane Helene in there, with claims in North Carolina very high, but also a lot in Michigan. So might be some more going on in the manufacturing sector there.
Gotcha. Great to talk to Molly Smith, as always. People get all worked up at 8:30, right? You start calling in trades. Everyone freaks out. Then you talk to Molly. You're reminded the sun will come up the next day. Thank you, as always, Molly Smith in New York, Bloomberg Economics editor. As I remind you now, this is all we're going to get. This is it. September Consumer Price Index report is the last one before the election. And for that matter, before the next Fed meeting, which is, at least it begins, the day after the election. Our signature panel is with us on this important economic day. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are here, of course, both Bloomberg Politics contributors. She is political science professor at Iona University. He is a partner at Stone Court Capital. So It's an interesting moment here, Jeanne. This is all we're going to get. There's no more debates. Donald Trump said just yesterday he's not going to do it again with Kamala Harris. And we're pretty much all out of the big economic data. Is it time to start closing arguments?
Well, and he not only said it, Joe, as you know, he said it in all caps. So I guess that means he really
fair
means
enough.
No debate. Maybe he'll change his mind. But, I think, they are making something of closing arguments, but you just got to underscore how important the news is today and the economy is overall. I was really struck by the latest Gallup poll, which said that is the issue 52% of Americans agree on as the most important issue, describing it as extremely important. Another 38 saying very important. So you're up in the 80% plus range of Americans who say the economy is it for them when they go in the polling booth. And so what that means is in these closing statements, so to speak, they better be focusing, Harris and Trump, on the economy and what their plans are. That has got to be the number one issue that they talk about. And so far, I think the two of them have done that to a certain extent, but you can't do it enough. So they've got to get on this economic policy bandwagon.
It's a very important point that Jeanne makes here. That Gallup poll out yesterday finds the economy is the number one issue for both Republicans and Democrats. A majority of voters put them together, 52%. With a pretty stark partisan divide, Rick, on the way you look at the economy. Based on all the data now, we've got what we're going to get. The snapshot of the economy on the eve of this election favors whom?
Look, I think that it favors those who, looking through the prism of who you like for president. As you point out, if you're a Republican, you think the economy is horrible. If you're a Democrat, you think the economy is great. Now, it helps that the news today, for instance, on CPI is pretty good. It helps that this week we've had a record, run up in the markets, and so consumer attitudes are improving. But I would say, if you're the Biden administration, if you're the Harris campaign, you wanted to have seen a lot more improvement in these metrics by now. How much of this is going to seep in between now and Election Day? I really question, because you have a lot of people voting today. They're voting on the economy that they woke up to today. And so do they feel better about it than they did 4 years ago under Donald Trump? And I do think one of the unique things in this election is Donald Trump left office in 2020 with a 35% approval rating or something near there. Today, he has a 50% job approval rating as president. So people have forgotten what they didn't like and have focused on what they liked. So that's as much of what they're battling as the economy itself.
So what do you think, Jeanne? The S&P 500 hit its 44th record high of the year yesterday. When you listen to what Rick Davis just said, think about the broad snapshot on the economy, knowing the different ways that D's and R's look at that. You can't argue the 44th record high on the S&P 500. To what extent does the wealth effect from this market help the incumbent, if at all? Wall Street seems that at least there's a narrative that Wall Street favors Donald Trump because of a lower corporate tax rate. But is this something that the Harris campaign needs to start highlighting in the closing hours of this campaign?
Oh, absolutely. I will go to my grave, hopefully not soon, so to speak, saying that September 18th was the best day for Kamala Harris and the Harris campaign because of the drop in interest rates. Those macroeconomic numbers help them. They need to talk about them, and they need to keep talking about them. But the reality is they also have to understand where people are when they go to the grocery store and go to get gas, and the costs are high. And so they've had this really difficult challenge as the incumbent, so to speak, of walking that line. And I thought that's why what Kamala Harris started to do on The View the other day is something that she should do all the time, which is keep introducing new economic policies. In this case, she was talking about how to help about 100 million Americans who are trying to care for elderly people in their homes. Now, Whether that is economically sound, I have some questions about. And of course, it got overshadowed by her hugging of Joe Biden. But that aside, she needs to be putting out these economic ideas, and she needs to stick with them, and she needs to talk about this at these macro numbers that look good for them, and keep talking about how she's going to do things better than Joe Biden did or differently as it pertains to costs, especially
I don't know
housing.
who's keeping track. I understand, Jeannie. I don't know who's keeping track of all these proposals on the daily, though. You mentioned that one from Kamala Harris 2 days ago, right, involving support for home health aides. Rick, last night, Donald Trump dropped another one, no income tax on expats. We're the 10th of October. At what point does the window close on new proposals? How much more room do people have in their brains for this?
Yeah, I think the window closed a long time ago. I mean, you hit it, Joe. I mean, politics is about repetition. There's going to be no recall. If I took a poll today and asked people, what have you seen, read, or heard about these campaigns lately? And you ask Donald Trump supporters, what they think, and they're not going to be able to repeat any of this stuff. They've heard it one time. That's why you do advertising over and over and over on the same issue, because it's hard to get through to these voters. They got a few distractions in places like Georgia and Florida and North Carolina. And so this is an incredible mistake that both campaigns are making, that in the last, 4 weeks of the election, they're introducing new ideas into the voters. It's only going to add confusion. Kamala Harris is fighting yesterday's battle. Yesterday's battle was, you're not detailed enough. We don't know your proposals. She's done as much as she could do on that. And now's the time just to reinforce.
Advice from Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. I hope they're listening. I know they like to get this program whenever they can, not just on the radio, but on YouTube, where you can find us now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live, because we're not done with our panel. Coming up next, a lot more with Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino and the politics of a hurricane. We've just had another set of remarks added by Joe Biden. He's going to address the nation coming up in about 90 minutes with the initial reaction, the response to Hurricane Milton. Avoided the worst in Florida, but they're still dealing with a very dangerous situation, as we heard from Congresswoman Castor early this hour. We'll have much more ahead on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us live on YouTube.
CPI Thursday, known to some as Little Friday. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, the fastest hour in politics today. It's like the old days, as we hand things over a little early to Bloomberg Business Week and an important series of conversations ahead coming up from Screen Time in L.A. They are convening a meeting as we speak in the Situation Room at the White House. President Biden and the Vice President, along with members of the administration, getting together to talk about the impacts of Hurricanes Milton and Helene, of course, within 2 weeks of each other at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Joe Biden will be holding forth with an update from the White House. Much like yesterday, he'll be addressing the American people about the initial impacts of this storm. And of course, we've got a lot of different layers of politics surrounding natural disasters this week that we want to talk about with our political panel. But I have to first not only bring in Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. You know them well if you're here every day on this program. She is political science professor at Iona University. He is partner at Stone Court Capital. But if you hear this hour, typically the 12 noon hour, you never get to hang out with Kailey. And so we thought we'd bring Kailey Leinz in as well. Of course, normally you hear her at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming over.
Hey, Joe.
We thought
nice
we'd hang
to
out
be
for
here.
a little bit. Absolutely.
Shaking things up.
Yes, we have Rick, we have Jeanne, we have Kailey, which means that we can do anything here. Last evening was something, listening to Joe Biden. Actually fact-checking Donald Trump from the White House, and you wonder if he gets into that more today.
Well, he very well might, as he is making the case that the government is there to help people despite some of the misinformation that is out there. The concern, of course, being that it is going to affect human lives, as we already have seen lives that were lost in the storm when it made landfall in Florida yesterday. Still millions without power, access to clean drinking water, an issue in some areas. And when humanity hangs in the balance, perhaps that underscores the need to make sure the facts are out there. Yeah,
that's for sure. Let's start with our panel and see how this is playing. I can go in a lot of different directions here, Rick Davis, whether it's misinformation or just actually getting the job done. But there are political implications anytime you see the recovery from a storm here. Is Florida now on the second storm going to go through what we did the first time with misinformation and rumors and social media and the fact-checking and all the rest of it, or have we gotten that out of our systems?
I don't think we've gotten it out of our systems. I woke up this morning reading a piece that James Carville was talking about, and he was criticizing the Harris and Biden administration for losing ground on the narrative about how effective these kinds of responses are going to be. And even though you have to sort through all this dis and misinformation, and it's being done for primarily, if not singularly, political purposes, you have to respect the fact that James Carville makes the point that if you lose the control of the narrative, then what is being put out there as misinformation becomes the truth to many voters. And so it doesn't surprise me that President of the United States has to go out and knock down these rumors, because he runs the risk of getting sort of end run by a fake narrative that people have a tendency to right now believe conspiracy theories. And some of them are so outlandish you can dismiss them, but not all of them. And so I think you're going to see a real effort on the part of the Harris campaign and the Biden White House to try and knock this stuff down so they don't lose control over a narrative, which is the American government stands by people who have been injured and lost property and lives from these natural disasters, and that should not be at all a question, that we're going to do everything we can to support them.
Well, everything they can, Jeannie, doesn't necessarily mean that rescue and recovery efforts will go perfectly, as we saw in North Carolina. While there broadly was applauding for the emergency personnel who did respond, we know there were some delays in western parts of the state. Access was an issue. The troops didn't necessarily get there on the timeline that was originally proposed. If there are weaknesses, any of them in the federal response, even if by and large they do try to show up in the best way possible for these people who are affected, how poorly does that reflect back on the vice president herself, since she is the candidate in consideration here?
It's an enormous problem. And, I am surprised, I have to say, that Joe Biden is going out and trying to fact check on this. The reality is Joe Biden is not a great communicator at this point. God bless him. He wants to fact check, and he's right to fact check. But the reality is the White House and the Harris campaign need somebody front and center, the way they did, or we did during COVID, for instance, to come out and say, we are in a crisis. This is what we're doing. This is the information we have. There are a lot of great communicators in the White House, in the Democratic Party. One person who's been named, you guys know well, Mitch Landrieu. Get somebody out who can correct this misinformation. And I would just add that I spent a lot of yesterday with young people, and I could repeat just enormously for a long time the amount of misinformation that they are getting, and they believe a lot of what they are hearing. It's got to be fact checked, but Joe Biden is not the person to do it out of the White House. And it's important for the campaign and the people in the South who are dealing with all of this.
We saw a post from Anna Paulina Luna, not typically one to be working with or complimenting Joe Biden. Rick, of course, representing a chunk of Florida here, says she just got off the phone with Joe Biden, who is personally overseeing that FEMA does not create problems with the debris removal and supportive of the $15 billion in FEMA funds only for hurricane victims. She ends the post by saying, this needs to happen. Congress, a special session. Speaker Johnson, call us back. Is that going to be the next step in this reaction from Washington, Rick? Do lawmakers, in fact, need to come home back to Washington despite what the speaker is saying?
Well, I certainly think it's good politics. What else are they doing? I mean, running for re-election? They got 4 more weeks. The reality is that they'd actually make more friends and find more votes if they came back to Washington and hustled up a supplemental to help support victims of these hurricanes. I mean, the reality is the entire country, if not large portions of the world, have been watching what's been happening here. It's an extraordinary set of conditions that have existed, and it would just be rational that the Republican leadership would say, you know what, we've got to get our piece of this. We're going to come in and we're going to show our support for these folks. But I think they've been distracted by all this disinformation that's emanating from Mar-a-Lago, and they think somehow that now they can't be part of the solution. They have to just point out the problems, and that is taking politics in the wrong direction. And frankly, I think going to hurt a lot of the momentum of these Republican congressional candidates if they sign on to this kind of thing.
Well, it's not just the congressional candidates to consider, but Senate ones as well. As Senator Rick Scott, the Republican incumbent in Florida, who is up for re-election this cycle, has also called for potentially supplemental funding emergency session. We have new polling from the New York Times and Siena College that finds while Trump is up 13 points in Florida in the presidential race, Senator Scott is ahead by 9 points. A separate Marist poll finds him up by just 2 points against his Democratic opponent. Rick, when you consider the impact of this particular natural disaster, how does it affect Senator Scott's race?
Well, I think he's going to get graded on how they feel the federal response is occurring. And he can't have the luxury of spreading misinformation and thinking that's somehow going to help him. He is the primary elected official who's connected to the federal response, connected to FEMA, connected to the White House, who needs to make sure that the people of Florida are taken care of. And so I'm not surprised that he's calling for a special session. I know that, it would show that he is doing something in this regard. There's little he can do at home directly other than be a catalyst for federal action. So being a catalyst means getting something done. If he does nothing in the next 4 weeks, it's not going to help him get reelected.
Interesting. Kailey points to this Siena College New York Times poll, Jeanne, and it brings troubling news for Democrats in these Senate races, not just Florida, but also Montana and Texas. And they conclude here that the GOP is on a clear path to winning Senate control. Does any element of the response to these storms affect that outcome?
It absolutely does. First of all, you and Kailey know that this was very distressing for me, as I have a bet with Rick Davis about Texas, and to see this thing by
Yes,
4 points, it's very distressing. Although I would add, if I could, that that state is still the one where the Democrats have the best shot. So Colin Allred has got to come through just for me. Beyond that, this is, I think, where, forget all the noise, forget the storm. We knew this was going to be a really tough year for Democrats. The map has totally worked against them. And we're seeing that. And of course, Montana looks like it is lost already. You were just talking about Florida. Sure, the storm can change that, but you still have Scott up, and of course, Colin Allred is still down by 4 in Texas. So it is looking very much like the Republicans have a very good shot of taking the Senate. And, one thing just to add to the conversation on Florida and Rick Scott is the fact that housing and insurance costs are it's really hard to get insurance, as you know, in Florida, and the costs are exorbitant. And that's something Democrats have been talking about for the last several years. That may help turn the state, but I don't think it's going to happen this year.
All right, so that's a look down the ballot. If we could zoom back up and look at the presidential race, we, of course, learned yesterday that there will be no rematch in terms of a debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, at least according to Trump. Harris, of course, had agreed to an October 23rd debate on CNN. Now CNN today has proposed 2 separate town halls with the candidates on the network on that date. We're getting reporting that Harris has agreed to participate, not sure yet, on Donald Trump. Jeanne, if he decides not to participate or to counter programming in some way, net, who benefits from that?
I think it's important for her to go out and to keep talking to voters. I say the same thing about him. But if he's going to counter program, I don't think his absence from CNN is going to hurt him all that much. The reality is that Donald Trump has been out there trying to speak to the people in his base, and he has been doing so successfully. CNN is not that audience, so I don't think it hurts him that much if he stays away from it. Maybe another story if he gets an invite from Fox and declines that.
All right, guys, great conversation as always. Jeanne Zaino and Rick Davis, a rare appearance by Kailey Leinz here at the noontime Eastern hour. Great to see both of you. Partner at Stone Court Capital, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, political science professor at Iona University. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.